fine, and I'm enjoying the little taste of spring we're getting this week.
Oh man, it was short sleeve weather here.
Okay, well, it's kind of getting that way here in the Pittsburgh area. So
It's supposed to hit 80 tomorrow.
okay,
You still got snow there?
enjoy. Yeah, no, it's warm enough that the snow's gone. So I'm just enjoying getting ready for tonight's show as well as the weather. So I'm ready to go.
You got your windows open. I got my AC on.
No, I have the window shut. I don't want the frack trucks to drown out our discussion.
We got a good show tonight, don't we?
Oh yeah, yeah. We have David Brody returning tonight to discuss his book, The Isaac Question, and he covered giants in his The Oath of Nimrod in his last book, and he was here discussing with us. Isaac covers the Templars, a variety of ancient artifacts, stone chambers in New England, Rosslyn Chapel, reevaluating biblical characters and Egyptian history, hidden agendas in academia. So it's a little bit of everything. We're just try to get through a lot of this, for about the first hour. So, welcome, Dave. How are you tonight?
Great, Mark. Great to be with you and Thomas again. I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, it's like, with all this, Cam and Amanda being involved in Middle Eastern history and politics, gun running. If you don't have an NSA file on you as the show starts, you'll have one by the time it ends. I mean, you have a really neat book.
It's I love Thomas's introduction talking about if people really believe that Columbus discovered America, we got news for you, and and so this is the fifth book in the series, and when I first sort of stumbled into this whole area of history, this dusty hidden corner of history of what happened in America before Columbus, and I dove down that rabbit hole first in like 2007, and I am still forging around down here. 5 books later, there is so much history and so many different artifacts and sites across North America that scream out that there are people here before Columbus, waves of people here before Columbus, not just one or two, but over and over again. And so, like you said, Cam and Amanda are having a lot of fun. Those are my characters, and I'm still having a great time with it, and I hope readers are too, because to me it's fascinating. It's eye-opening. It's crazy how little we really know about the history of this continent.
Yeah, and this is Cam and Amanda appear in the Oath of Nimrod in this book. Have they been in all 7 or 8 of your novels?
So there are 5 books in this series, and I call it they're all fiction, they're all novels, but they're historical fiction. And the series is called the Templars in America series. And again, there's 5 books in that series, and Cam and Amanda have been the recurring characters in all 5 of those stories.
Okay. And these stories are independent of each other, right?
Right. So it's recurring characters, but the stories, each of the stories focuses on, a certain set of artifacts and sites that seem to evidence a different group of explorers who came over to North America. So the first book sort of focuses on stuff in New England that seems to evidence that the Knights Templar were here. The second book does more of the same. The third book goes out to New Mexico and Arizona and looks at some maybe some the Toltec civilization and the connection there between some early Jewish late Roman explorers, as evidenced by the Tucson lead artifacts. And then the fourth book talks about the Phoenicians coming over here in the Oath of Nimrod and related to the giants. And now in this book, I focus in on Brendan the Navigator, the Irish explorer from the 6th century, and a lot of stone chambers in New England that are mysterious and seem to defy explanation. And I think they're likely the result of Brendan the Navigator and other Celtic explorers, again, coming over here about 1,500 years ago. So all sorts of different waves of explorers coming across the Atlantic.
Yeah, and you start your book on the southwestern coast of Ireland in what's like 600 AD,
Right.
with Saint Brendan. You get some intrigue, going in the first chapter. Then you jump ahead to modern day Boston. You know that the way you structured that you're going to introduce some kind of idea or artifact, something made a transatlantic crossing, long ago, and it wraps up Cam and Amanda in all the intrigues that take them through the novel. So let's look at some of these ideas, like the stone chambers in New England. They feature in quite a few chapters of the Isaac question. Where did you get the idea for the property that Cam, I would say, like, it inherit, or it comes into possession of,
Right.
with your work on the Upton Chamber with the Vieira Brothers TV show?
All right, so let's start with so let's back up for a second and give an overview. So in New England and also in eastern New York State, there are hundreds of these stone chambers all throughout the countryside. And when the earliest colonists came here, many of them remarked about these mysterious stone chambers. They were here before we got here. There's a really interesting writing from 1654 about a fur trader in Connecticut writing about these mysterious stone chambers, and he was the first, quote unquote, pioneer or colonist to be there, and the Native Americans never laid claim to it. And so there's all these strange, mysterious stone chambers, and the quote unquote experts, the historians, tell us that they must have been colonial root cellars. Well, all right, some of them are definitely colonial root cellars, but many of them, it doesn't make any sense that the colonial root cellars. Either they're not near any farm, or the workmanship is so elaborate that they are clearly ceremonial of some kind, or they have 20 or 25 ton roof slabs. Why would a farmer bother with something like that?
Right.
And many of them line up to solstice and equinox alignments. But even so, the experts continue to insist that, well, they must be, they must just be elaborate colonial root cellars. Well, all this changed about a year ago with a stone chamber in the town of Upton, which is west of Boston. It's actually right near the beginning of the Boston Marathon race in a town called Hopkinton. And the town of Upton was preserving this chamber as sort of a local town park, and they did an archaeological study of it while they were preserving it. And one of the things they did was something called luminescence testing. And what luminescence testing does is it takes a look at the soil, and you can identify when the last time was the soil was exposed to sunlight. I'm not going to get into the science and explain how that works, but it's a really solid piece of science. And they were amazed to learn that this particular chamber, the dirt that went into the walls of the chamber, had not been exposed to sunlight in at least 1,000 years. So
Wow.
It could not have been colonial. It could be even older than 1,000 years, because that could have just been a repair job of an even older chamber. So now all of a sudden it's like, whoa, wait, it's not a colonial root cellar. So now the quote-unquote experts say, well, it must have been Native American. Well, that's all well and good, except for the Native Americans shrug their shoulders and say, it's not ours, we make no claim to this. And, the Native Americans are very rigorous and zealous in protecting their culture and their history, as they should be. So when they tell you, not ours, you got to sort of listen to them. And there's lots of other reasons why it doesn't make sense that it's theirs. I mean, the stones have been worked You would need metal tools to work these stones. And there's lots of reasons why, just beyond the fact they tell you it's not there, is that it probably is not Native American. So if it's not Native American and it can't be colonial, well, now we need to find another candidate who built this. And that takes us back to, especially because these stone chambers look so much like what we have in the British Isles, that takes us back to Brendan the Navigator and other Celtic explorers who, according to Irish legend, came across the Atlantic in the mid-6th century A.D. And so that's where the novel sort of starts, and that's where we start playing connect the dots with these mysterious stone chambers around New England.
Okay, and one of the interesting things about these stone chambers that I never realized is the entrances can frequently have metal in them that throws off a compass.
Yeah. So again,
I like that.
There's some great stuff about these chambers. And let me just say, Mark, if you were to see these chambers in Europe, there would be no doubt in your mind that they go back to the early Neolithic sites like Stonehenge and Maze Howe, and I mean they look that old. But yeah, what you mentioned. So what I think happened when we talk about Brendan the Navigator, the legend is he came over with 14 monks plus 2 or 3 quote unquote pagans. Now this is a time when Christianity is just moving into Ireland, and a lot of Christians were still pagans, and a lot of pagans were becoming Christianized. And when you think of pagans during that time period, think of Druids, and when you think of Druids, think of Merlin the magician from the old King Arthur legend. So picture Merlin the magician, and so it's likely that there are a couple of Merlin-like people with Brendan on this voyage, and they're coming over here. Brendan's coming over here to convert the natives to Christianity, and Merlin's got all these tricks up his sleeves because the Druids obviously were in the same business, and that is trying to convince the local people that they had some kind of mysterious powers. So one of the things that we find in these chambers, as you mentioned, is some interesting magnetic anomalies, and we think what happened is they buried magnetic stones in the entranceway as a way to convince the local natives that they had some kind of magic. So it's an old parlor trick. You take a bowl of oil or water, and you float a metal pin on it, and you can, by talking to the gods, you can put that bowl of water with a pin on it in the entryway of the chamber and make it spin around. And imagine the effect you would have on some people if you could claim that you could make the needle spin, and indeed you could. So it's interesting that some of these chambers have these fascinating electromagnetic anomalies, which I think were just parlor tricks as a way to trick the natives.
Yeah, I can speak to the God and you can't. See, here's my proof.
Well, exactly, and even that was probably just one of their tricks. I think probably their biggest trick was knowing how to predict things like eclipses. If you were experts in astronomy, as a lot of these ancient seafarers and explorers were, and you could say to the people, the gods are mad at you, and they're gonna show their anger in 3 days. The sun is going to disappear, and then it actually happens. Imagine how powerful that would make you if people actually thought you could predict something like that and be right.
Okay, so some of this book is set at the Upton Chamber area, or it's based on the Upton Chamber.
Right.
You also set some of the story at Gunjewump. That's still an intriguing site. I may have to get
right.
as like a spokesperson from there to actually be a guest and explain it. But is Gunjewump's characteristic of these beehive chambers and stone chambers from Ireland? I've never been there, so I just
right. So the Gunjewump site is down in Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
It has not only a stone chamber but other carvings on rock, a stone circle. It's a very mysterious site. And one of the really interesting things about that site is the Native American tribes of the area believed it was haunted. And so the Pequot tribe, they would not go onto that land area. And this is the era when I mentioned earlier that the fur trader in 1654 wrote about this amazing stone chamber that he couldn't figure out who built it. And one of the reasons why he was so confused is because he knew the Pequot tribe wouldn't go onto that forest, and because they thought it was haunted. And so this site is really interesting. It's got a stone chamber. It lines up to both solstice and equinox alignments, illuminations. The term Gungy is Gaelic or Irish for Church of the People, and there is carbon dating indicating activity there in the mid-6th century A.D., which, again, could be Native American, except for the fact they believed the area was haunted and didn't go in there. The carbon dating was of charcoal on a fire. So those dates fit really nicely in with, again, we're back to Brendan the Navigator in the mid-6th century.
Well, yeah, that, when we had Dr. Cheryl Klassen on last May or June, she did talk about some of archaic cultures had a site avoidance characteristic of their culture. Yeah, a lot. Ideas. You can find that in all kinds of cultures where just don't go to certain places. It's just passed on from generation to generation. So
right. Well, one of the reasons why the Gunjawat site was believed to be haunted is because they have this interesting tectonic activity where the underground the tectonic plates are rubbing together and oftentimes creating these, they're called earthquake lights. You get these pink and light blue lights that float in the air. I'm not sure scientifically why this happens, but you see this oftentimes right before a major earthquake. You'll actually see these lights floating. And this particular area has a lot of activity, and so the natives would see these lights floating above the swamps and whatnot and believed it to be haunted. So, and I'm sure, look, I'm going back to the Druids and Merlin, I'm sure that they took advantage of these sites to also claim that they were in communication with the gods, and they were creating these lights and the sort of light shows in the woods. But yeah, I think that ancient peoples obviously oftentimes had superstitions that kept them out of certain areas, believing them to be occupied by the spirits.
No, it's just, I think everyone has some house in the neighborhood that's haunted. Still, same principle that still goes on today.
Right.
But okay. So that's an interesting explanation for Gunjawamp. Okay, and there's also some of the Cairo carvings on the site.
Right. So the other thing about Gunjawamp, again, there's lots of things about that site that sort of point back to the 6th century. But there's a very faded rock carving of a Cairo symbol, and that basically what a Cairo symbol is sort of a backwards P and almost an X going through the stem of the P. It's an ancient symbol, Cairo being the first two letters of the word Christos, an ancient symbol, especially in the Ireland area of Jesus Christ. And if you see, even churches today in Ireland have that symbol oftentimes above their entryway. So this carving is at the Gunjawamp site, and it's just another in the list of pieces of evidence that allow us to tie this site back to ancient Ireland, or not ancient Ireland, but Dark Age Ireland, the 6th century Ireland.
Is the Cairo symbol? It sounds like it's really faded. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a good. I'm sorry. What was that?
Oh, it can't be a recent carving. It's
right. It's so faded that it's really hard to make out. I mean, anybody who's worked with these kinds of stone carvings knows this, but really the only time to really get a good look at these things is you need to go at night, and then what you need to do is wet the carving with just water, and then use low-angle light. And that's really the way to see these carvings. But it's really hard to photograph it that way. So, oftentimes people who are interested in investigating these sites go at night because the direct sunlight really sort of bleaches things out or washes things out, and you don't get to see the definition. But that carving is clearly very, very old. And again, so old that it's almost faded completely away.
Okay, well, since we're on the Cairo symbol, you bring up some other interesting themed symbols found throughout history, like the skull and crossbones, the Cairo, and the ancient Egyptian crook and flail symbols. You work them throughout. Some scenes to help Cam and Amanda to make some realizations. Can you link all those ideas together?
That's one of those visual things. But if you think of the skull and crossbones, which I think most people know is sort of a pirate symbol, but many people may not know. The pirates actually took that symbol from the Knights Templar. The Templars, when they went to battle, their sort of rule of their order was they were never allowed to let a fallen comrade lie in the battlefield. So they would, if they couldn't carry the whole body, they would take his skull and his two thigh bones, and they'd bring that back for burial. And so that became their symbol, the skull and crossbones. And then later, pirates adopted that because the Templars were so respected and so feared, the pirates thought that they could sort of piggyback on that. And so that's where that symbol comes from. But that symbol, if you look at some of the old Cairo symbols, is very similar. And I think what's going on there, and as is the hook and flail, and I can't really, the Egyptian crook and flail, sorry. I get to this a lot in my book. I'm not sure it's going to be something I can describe quickly, but there's a connection going way back to the ancient Egyptians that ties the Egyptians into the ancient Druids, and then later on the Templars, and then also the Freemasons. That this line, it's really a line of sun worshippers, is really what happens. And I'm getting a little off track, I realize, but that's a theme that continues all the way through this book. And it's important because these chambers, these stone chambers in New England, are, I think, ways that the ancient peoples used to worship the sun. They align to solar alignments, solstices and equinoxes and cross-quarter days, sunsets and sunrises. And this goes way back all the way to ancient Egypt. And I think if you go into a Masonic lodge, a Freemason lodge, you see all this symbolism and iconography that takes you back to ancient Egypt. And no one ever was able to explain to me why the Freemasons were so interested in ancient Egypt. It's not really part of their their story, their backstory. Where the backstory has to do with King Solomon's temple, but that's not Egypt. And I think what's going on is that the Freemasons derive from the Druids derive from the Egyptians, and they all tie back to sun worship. So that's a long, roundabout answer to your question, Mark. I'm sorry about that. But the one thing about this story, this book, the research behind it was really complex. There were so many layers to this story. And when I started my research and started, foraging around in again, these dusty corners of history, I had no idea I was going to come all the way back to the ancient Egyptians. But to mix my metaphors, I just started following the breadcrumbs, and that's where I ended up.
Okay. Well, it is interesting. It was just like what we're talking about. The archaic people did the site avoidance, and it's like the same idea, just passed on to the next generation. It's the same symbols, things being crossed on King Tut's tomb, the crook and flail being crossed on King Tut's tomb, and it just keeps perpetuating over the generations.
Right. These ancient symbols, just as the church often sort of piggybacks off the ancient pagan sites to build their churches,
Right.
So too do new religions piggyback off of the symbolism of old religions. It's a way to get people to accept the new religion or the new church. If it's familiar looking to them, they're more willing to accept it.
Okay, and yeah, you also one of the interesting aspects of your book was the contrast of the Stone of Destiny and Bethel Stone. Yeah, you get
Right.
These sacred stones coming out of the Middle Eastern legends, biblical stories. Yeah, how did you work those in? Find out about these stones and trace their wanderings to
that's the wanderings, exactly. And you, I'm not sure if you meant to use that word, but wanderings is exactly right in the sense of the wandering Jews of the Old Testament, because those stones, they start out, one of them is supposedly, Jacob's pillow, and he has the dream about Jacob's ladder, but they end up, these stones, they end up in, England of all places, Scotland and England, back and forth. And I happened to be visiting my daughter who was studying in Edinburgh, University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and the Stone of Destiny is there, supposedly. And the question, I immediately said, well, how did that end up in the British Isles of all places? But the story is, and again, this came up when we were in Edinburgh. This was right before the Scottish election. They were electing whether to secede from England, and they ended up not passing. But at the time, Muhammad al-Fayed, Dodi Fayed's father, the boyfriend of Princess Diana, was leading the fight to have the Scottish people vote to secede. He believes, well, first of all, he's angry at the English, so he wanted the Scots to secede, but he believes that the Scottish people descend from ancient Egyptian explorers, that the word Scota for Scotland is the name of a princess, a daughter of a pharaoh who was exiled, and that this daughter and her family made their way across the Middle East into Spain and eventually through the Mediterranean, up the Straits of Gibraltar, and into Scotland, and that they brought with them the Stone of Destiny. But that's how it ended up in the British Isles, and he believes, and other historians also believe, that the island of Scotland, or the land of Scotland, was originally settled by the Egyptians. Not originally, because the Picts were there first, but the modern day Scots, many of them descend from these Egyptians, and so it was really a far-reaching. Again, the research in this was so far-reaching. Every time I started looking at something, it just kept going back in time, and eventually all tied together really back in Egypt.
Okay, so do you want to get into discussing Scota's lineage, or is that giving away too much of the book?
Yeah, well, we talked a little bit about, but so
Okay.
Again, so Scota.
There's a reason. Her heritage is a reason for keeping possession of the stones, or at least one of them.
Right. Yeah, and that probably gets too deep into the plot of the book itself. But what's fascinating to do, and what I do in the book, and I hope the readers find it fascinating too, is if you look at the history of who we think Scota was the daughter of the pharaoh Akenaten. And the thing about Akenaten, he was exiled. It makes everything sort of fits together. What's fascinating about Akenaten is he was the first and really only pharaoh to be monotheistic. And not only monotheistic, but he believed in sun worship. And that's where this all sort of ties back, and this may tie the ancient Egyptians to the Freemasons and to the Druids, but it all goes back to Akenaten, who we think was Scota's father. And when Akenaten was exiled, that's when Scota went off into exile too, and ended up eventually in Scotland. By the way, she had a son named Hyber, and before they ended up in Scotland, they were in Ireland, where they conquered the local people and renamed the island Hibernia after her son. And so that sort of holds together as well. But eventually they ended up in Scotland. But the tie-in with her goes back to Akenaten and sun worship.
Okay, and since we've stopped in Scotland, you cover Rosslyn Chapel, the Sinclair family. Yeah, those are kind of some big names in what do they call it, alternative history now. With all the Sinclair information about the connection with the Orkney Island flag, and with the Nova Scotia flag is very similar.
So the Mi'kmaq tribe in Nova Scotia has a very similar flag. Yes,
right. That's it. So, so there's a big story there. You might as well get into who are the Sinclair family.
All right, so the Sinclair family, they're sort of like the Where's Waldo of alternative history, because they turn up in every story. I mean, they're everywhere. It's a fascinating story. They turned up in the Da Vinci Code novel, which is based on Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and they're the family named by the Holy Blood, Holy Grail authors as being the Bloodline family, and they're the family that built Rosslyn Chapel. And Rosslyn Chapel, of course, if you've never been to Scotland, you've got to go see Rosslyn Chapel. Rosslyn Chapel, although it purportedly is a Christian place of worship, it really is it's a couple things. But one of the things it is a monument to Freemasonry, and that's because the Sinclair family for hundreds of years were the hereditary Grand Masters of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. But it also is has a lot of Templar history and symbolism, Knights Templar history and symbolism, because going back a couple hundred years before it was built, one of the original Knights Templar was married to a Sinclair woman. So I didn't give you the dates here. The chapel was built in the mid-1400s. So going back a few hundred years, we have a whole history of the Knights Templar there, and then going forward for a few hundred years, we have the Freemasonic connection. So not only is the chapel, Rosslyn Chapel, have a lot of carvings that are indicative of a tie to Freemasonry, but it also has a lot of carvings that are pagan in nature. They have things called green men, so it always seems to be green. It's a face of a man, but growing from the face are roots and vines and leaves. Again, a very pagan type symbolism. They have a lot of Old Testament carvings, but Old Testament in sort of an alternative version of that. So, for example, Moses is portrayed there, but he has a devil's horns on either side of his head. So there's some really interesting things going on carving-wise in this chapel. I like to think of Rosslyn Chapel as sort of being the history of Scotland carved in stone. There are thousands of sculptures and carvings on the walls and the roof and the ceilings of this chapel, and through it all, whether it's Christianity or paganism or ties back to ancient Egypt or Freemasonry, you can find something in that chapel that really tells the story of Scotland. Included in that are some carvings that scream out to people who are careful observers that members of the Sinclair family had been to North America prior to Columbus, and that member would have been Prince Henry Sinclair in 1398, 1399. That's another whole legend, but there's strong evidence based on the carvings at Rosslyn Chapel that did occur. And in fact, if you go to Rosslyn Chapel, there's a whole big informational placard there talking about how Prince Henry Sinclair in 1398 came first to Nova Scotia and then in 1399 down to the coast of New England.
So you brought up the Moses skulls with the horn, or the skull with the horns. We have the same thing in is it St. Peter in chains in Rome with Michelangelo's sculpture of
Right.
Moses with the horns on his head. What? Why is there this all about the same time period? There's the same misinterpretation of the Bible, or I don't
Right. It was just, it
understand
was
that.
just it was just a mistranslation.
Oh,
I'm sorry. That's the obvious answer. There was a mistranslation of the Bible. I think coming from Aramaic to to Greek to Hebrew, however it went, and there was a mistranslation that caused during that time period artists to portray Moses with horns. I think that it may be a little more complicated than that, and I can't really explain this to people without they have to read the book to sort of understand that. But there may be a more sort of hidden meaning behind portraying Moses with devil's horns. I don't think it was an accident. I don't think it was a mistranslation. I think that Bible scholars are tend to be more careful than that. I think there's a reason why Moses is portrayed with devil's horns, both in Rosslyn Chapel and by Michelangelo, and that again, people are interested can read the book and sort of get to that. But I don't think that's an accident.
okay. But it does lead to the cult of the head. These heads that feature throughout the your book, The Isaac Question, with all these different themes of whose head was cut off when, and it's really an unusual look at history.
So
Is it
the
the
head worship,
Baptist?
the skull worship or head worship, you find that obviously you actually do find a little bit of it in Christianity with some of the relic worship that we have. But you find this head worship. Ancient peoples believed that the sort of the life force was within someone's head, and so you see over and over again these stories. Think about John the Baptist. He was the whole story of Salome and the seven veils. But John the Baptist eventually was beheaded by King Herod, and that head was really never found. In my book, I theorize that head may have become the head that the Templars worshipped, the head of Baphomet, which was something that when the French king in 1307 outlawed the Templars, there was testimony about this head that they worshipped and kissed, and other representations of it have shown it as sort of the head of the devil or man beast type thing. But again, there's this line of skull worship. The Druids worship skulls. I mentioned the Templars. In Christianity, we have this John the Baptist. Again, even going back even further in ancient times, there's evidence of skull worship, and so that plays prominently into the Isaac Question story, and also ties back into Rosslyn Chapel as well, and some of the carvings, including Moses with the horns, that are portrayed on the chapel walls and ceiling.
Mm-hmm. It's you really do have an interesting book on this one. I enjoyed it, and people in the chat room are talking about some of the artifacts as well. You make a lot of other interesting points about Rosslyn Chapel. The corn and aloe is frequently brought up, but one of the really interesting points that makes a very convincing case that the Sinclair family did make the voyage here and to America in 1398 was the flower.
Right, the trillium. So I think many people who study this know about the aloe and the maize that are carved on the ceiling at Rosslyn Chapel. So again, just to review this, the chapel was built in 1456. long time before Columbus came over here. How would the carvers know what North American maize and aloe looked like unless somebody had been here and brought back either samples or drawings to Scotland? Those plants are not known, do not grow in outside of North America. But one flower I was not aware of is something called a trillium, is also carved in Rosslyn Chapel, and that is also unique to the northeast section of North America, New England and Quebec and Ontario. So that's another flower that I wasn't aware of until I went over there, and the tour guide, who knew of my interest in this, pulled me aside and showed it to me, and they had just recently learned about it from a botanist. So again, that's another piece of evidence tying Prince Henry Sinclair to the New England area, and more evidence that, as you just mentioned, 1398, 1399, he island hopped his way across the North Atlantic and ended up in New England.
Okay. So,
What?
oh, go ahead, Thomas.
Wasn't there also a painting of an Indian with a headdress on there?
There's a painting, a mural in England, I think from around the year 1280, which seems to show a Native American shooting arrows into a European prince of some kind.
I thought it was there. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay, but it's dated 1280. It's fascinating. It's called the Dry Stoke mural. It's fascinating because it's the year 1280. It's in a church in England, and people tend to be careful about what they put in their churches, right? They don't make stuff up for their churches. And so it's 1280, and there's a European prince with a crown who was being shot by Native Americans with bows and arrows. And the Native Americans are wearing headdresses, and they're clearly dark-skinned, and they're clearly not European. So either the Native Americans invaded England in the year 1280, or before that, or some European before the year 1280 came over to North America and was shot by Native Americans here. Obviously I'm being facetious when I say Native Americans invaded England. I don't think that happened. But the Prince Madoc story fits right in with that legend, and I think that's what that mural represents. Madoc being a Welsh prince who legend has it came over here in the late 1100s, late 12th century. Pardon me.
Okay, and Dave, you with the corn and aloe and the trillium plants, you have photos of those plants in the book. It's not just a bunch of your words describing them. You have the documented proof included in your book. So that's one of the nice things about.
Right, I do that. So I've written 5 books in this series, and anytime I mention an artifact or a piece of evidence, I try to put a photo of it in the book, because I think that it's important that people understand that even though the book is fiction, the history I'm talking about, the sites, the artifacts, the paintings, the carvings, you can see them. They're real. I'm not making those things up. Now, obviously, I'm fictionalizing some of the things my characters do as they go through their adventure and try to figure this all out. But if they go to a site and I tell and in the book the characters talk about the site has been carbon dated back to X date, then that's real. I don't make that stuff up. That site is real, and the carbon dating is real. The history in the stories is authentic, and so I think it's important that the readers understand that, and I think it's important that I make it clear to the readers that these are actual sites, these are actual pieces of history that you can go out and see, and I feel really strongly that we've been this has been hidden from us. I mean, at a certain point, I used to have a hockey coach when I was a little, I was like 11 or 12 years old. We walked into the locker room one day, and I guess a men's league had been playing before us, and they left a bunch of empty beer cans on the ground. And he said, "Boys," he said, "when there's this many beer cans lying around, there's been some drinking going on." And it's like, well, that's what this is too. When there's this many artifacts here, there's got to have been something going on. I mean, you just can't have that many, literally dozens and dozens of these sites and artifacts. there has to have been a story behind them. They just didn't appear magically, or they're not naturally occurring carvings. These are man-made carvings. And so again, back to your question, I do put pictures in the books just because I think it helps. The picture tells a great story, and I also want the readers to really not doubt that these are actual pieces of history.
Now your lead character, Cam, is he an archaeologist?
No, God, no. The archaeologists would never agree to any of this stuff. The archaeologists,
well, that's why I asked.
I mean, my gosh, it's so funny. The archaeologists, they're worse than weathermen as far as the reliability goes. I mean, for years they've been telling us that civilization began in the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia in the years 6,000 years ago. I mean, we all have heard that ad nauseum. So they say 6,000 years ago. Well, it turns out we learn about the site in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. It's not, and it's high civilization, advanced civilization. It's not 6,000 years ago. It's 12,000 years ago. So they weren't just wrong; they were wrong by a factor of 2. I mean, they were only half right. Like 6,000, 12,000. They were way wrong, and probably goes back even further than that. So no. So Cam is he's an amateur historian. He actually is a lawyer by trade. But he has a real disdain for archaeology because these archaeologists, they have this thing that if they didn't find it in the ground, it can't be real evidence. That the only discipline that matters is archaeology. We can't possibly look at things like geology or cartography or linguistics or oral history or anything else. Nothing else matters to an archaeologist besides what they find in the ground. And, of course, the problem is, think of the percentage of ground that has been excavated in any given area. So in New England, how many times has an archaeologist done a dig looking for sites like this? It's minuscule. So who knows what's underground that they haven't dug to find yet? And for them to take the position that, well, if we haven't found any site that conclusively, is evidence of this pre-Columbian history means it didn't. They then conclude it didn't happen, which is just ridiculous. I mean, and then if you try to get an archaeologist to go out and dig for something pre-Columbian, they say to you, well, no, we don't believe in pre-Columbian exploration. Why would we waste our time on a dig? Well, it becomes circular reasoning at some point. If you're not going to dig, you can't then turn around and complain that we haven't found anything. I think at least do the dig and then say we didn't find anything. See, I told you so. But we have sites here, related to the Westford Knight site. This goes back to the Prince Henry St. Clair journey in 1398 and 1399. There are sites we would love to dig. We can't get archaeologists to go near it. A, they are closed-minded to it, but B, those few that might be open-minded to it realize that they will be ostracized if they do something like this. It's really a catch-22, and it's really frustrating.
But if they, Dave, you just mentioned that they don't want to consider. If we didn't find it in the grounds, well, it isn't part of history. Well, what you were saying earlier about the tectonic plates and around Gunjewump, America's Stonehenge is on a fault line, and supposedly they've been seen there. It's documented in the God's Word, Stone co-authored book, Mystery Hill, but that needs to be considered too. It's a natural phenomenon that may have attracted people to build in an area. It may have kept people away because it was just weird. They didn't understand what it was. It was just
have sacred
strange
sites all over the place, like Superstition Mountains and Brown's Mountain.
Yeah,
they all have them kind of lights.
Right,
Yeah.
and ancient people were
it?
drawn to that. They believe that that's where the energy of the earth flowed through along these. They call them salt lines or ley lines, or you hear them called rose lines sometimes. Actually, the word Rosslyn from Rosslyn Chapel was an ancient rose line. Yeah, these were the energy sources, energy fields along which ancient peoples always built their sacred sites. So, like you said, Mark, America's Stonehenge, Gunjewump, many sites in Europe this is where people believe the gods resided, and so they built their sites nearby.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and you were, you have a photo of the apprentice pillar. That pillar does feature in your book, but it also gets a lot of attention from the Templar researchers. It just features in a lot of research. Can you describe? It looks very ornate.
It is very ornate, and though I'm not a Freemason, I've done a lot of research about Freemasonry, and one of the basic initiation ceremonies, or this initiation one of the early stories that they teach to an initiate, is the story of how the master mason is away for a while, and he comes back, and his apprentice has built this really elaborate pillar, and it's so elaborate and so well crafted that the master mason is jealous of the apprentice and kills him, and that's why it's called the apprentice pillar. But what I find more interesting about that particular carving at Rosslyn Chapel, it's clearly Masonic. Again, Rosslyn Chapel was built in 1456. If you look up Freemasonry on Wikipedia or something, it tells you that it didn't really start until the early 1700s. Well, how can we have Masonic representations carved in 1456 if Freemasonry didn't start until hundreds of years later? I think, and other people agree with me, that Freemasonry really was just a carryover from the Knights Templar. That when the Templars were outlawed in 1307, they went underground and reconstituted themselves soon thereafter as the Freemasons, and most particularly in Scotland. And that's sort of the continuation that we see, and we see that continuation represented by the Sinclair clan, and we see that continuation in the carvings at Rosslyn Chapel. But no one's been ever able to explain to me, if Freemasonry didn't begin until the 1700s, why do we have Masonic carvings dating back to the late 1400s at Rosslyn Chapel?
Yeah, the Scottish Freemason connections, going to be covered when we have Janet Walter and Alan Butler on maybe next month or in May. But
both of them can talk about this expertly.
Yeah, and they also begin. They don't take it all the way back to Egypt. They do focus more on some of the more modern Freemason trades do stem from Scotland. So this is going to be an interesting just continuation of this discussion when we have them on. But just supplying buttressing evidence for you.
Right. So what I did mention, and I'd like to try to get this in at some point, is I began this journey. I mentioned that the Upton Chamber was sort of where I started the journey regarding the stone chambers. But one of the first things I read about was the patriot Thomas Paine. Give me liberty or give me death. He wrote a lot about the Freemasons back in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And what he said was that the Freemasons descended from the Druids, and the Druids descended from the Egyptians, and all three of those groups were sun worshippers: the Freemasons, the Druids, and the Egyptians. And again, I'd never heard of this connection drawing the Freemasons all the way back, first to the Druids and then second to the Egyptians. And that's where I really started looking at this. And there's a lot of evidence of that at Rosslyn Chapel, and also in a lot of these other sites around Europe. We haven't really gotten into many of those, not sites so much in Europe as the history of Europe, but it was Thomas Paine, ironically, the patriot, who first got me going down this path. But as I always like to say, that the Freemasons seem to be the Where's Waldo, as I mentioned earlier, of all these stories. They always seem to appear, just as Rosslyn Chapel always seems to appear. The Freemasons always seem to appear in all these hidden histories. Okay,
Dave, we have about 3 minutes left before the show, or the top of the hour break.
Mhm.
Uh, one quick question, and then you can plug your website. I've been putting it in the chat room as well. But yeah, part of the uh, intrigue and of the Isaac question revolves around all these hidden agendas in academia. Do you think it's really that nasty in the colleges?
I don't think you mentioned Janet Walter earlier. Scott, her husband Scott and I are good friends. Scott really thinks that there's a real cover up going on. I'm not willing to go that far. I think what happens in academia is that people are ignorant and that people are afraid of being ostracized and that people are really hesitant to change their mind. I don't think it's necessarily that they are participating in a cover-up of any kind. I just think that they don't know how to think outside the box, and they're afraid to think outside the box, and that's why we're stuck with this. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and we can't get past it. Even the archaeologists like to talk about how it only matters if it comes out of the ground, but the site up in Newfoundland where we first found evidence of the Vikings, the Lonsell Meadow site, even then it was the amateur archaeologists who insisted on digging there, and the professionals had to be dragged kicking and screaming up there. They sit in their offices in these campus centers or office buildings in the middle of the campus, and they just don't get out and participate in any of this cutting edge research. And of course, they're not going to find anything. So again, I don't think it's a I don't think it's a cover up as much as it is just sort of ignorance and the natural condition of some academics.
Academic laziness.
Laziness, protecting their own turf, all that stuff. So it's not evil as much as it is just incompetence.
We'll be right back, folks.
All right, thanks.
Eddie, doggone it. We'll get that fixed one day. I want to remind everybody we are totally listener supported, and from what I see out there in the chat room, the donations are down. We really need to kick it up a little bit. Hawk's doing quite a bit of work. We got 92 hosts. You just can't beat it, and if you want us to continue, we got to do it by your grace. So if you got a buck or two, we'd sure appreciate it. Come to the homepage and check out all the stuff there that you can get for donations. You'd be surprised. Some of it's pretty awesome. The archives are like $5 or $6, and that's 92 hosts. You just can't beat that for that price. I think the show's been going real good, Mark. I mean, I haven't had to talk but once or twice there, and I like it when it's like that.
Yeah, no, I'm really captivated by this topic. And Dave, you want to continue the discussion with the this Israeli Stonehenge? I haven't heard of that. What's the deal with that?
That was new to me too.
All right. Oh, good. So as you mentioned in the first hour, Mark, the 5 books in my series, they all focus on this history of America before Columbus, and it seems like every time I get into it, I always end up with my characters visiting the America Stonehenge site in New Hampshire, because there's so many tie-ins between that site and other sites around the world. One of the things that Dennis Stone, who's the owner of that site, his son, Kelsey, discovered a few years ago was the summer solstice sunrise alignment at the America Stonehenge site. So again, the site is a ceremonial center, and then surrounding the site are these standing stones out on the horizon, and they line up with solstices and equinoxes, sunrises and sunsets, cross-quarter days. The site essentially is a calendar in stone. So if you're in the middle of the site at the ceremonial center and you're looking out to the distance at the summer solstice sunrise, the sun sits like a golf ball on top of a tee the T being a standing stone out on the horizon, a vertically standing stone that was placed there, obviously on purpose, to mark the summer solstice sunrise. So that's fine. That's a very interesting, fascinating, very spiritually moving aspect of that site. What's really interesting and makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up is that if you could sort of picture yourself drawing a line from where you stand over the top of that stone and into the middle of the sun, that line would go across the Atlantic Ocean on a easterly but also a little bit northerly, because the summer solstice sunrise is a little bit north of east in the northern hemisphere. That line passes directly through the archway at Stonehenge in England. Think about that for a second.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, I think what happened was whoever built the Stonehenge site in New Hampshire reverse engineered it so that it lined up also with the summer solstice sunrise at Stonehenge in England. Okay, that's great. And some people say, well, man, that's maybe a coincidence and whatever. All right, so fine. It struck me that if it was not a coincidence, that line may also extend to another site in the Middle East. My theory being that the ancient Phoenicians built the site in New Hampshire, America Stonehenge. We know that the Phoenicians were in southern England at the time Stonehenge, England, was built. They were trading for tin being a necessary component for bronze. We think that they came to North America to get copper, the other component for bronze, okay? So if they were in America and built Stonehenge in America, and they were in southern England at the time Stonehenge, England, was built, perhaps they had a hand in building that as well. If we take that line and we continue that line going from Stonehenge, America to Stonehenge, England, and it continues over the curvature of the earth, and we have to make our head sort of do a twist, because even though we're heading north and east, we actually end up into the Middle East because of the curvature of the earth. That line now pops down into an area in what was used to be Phoenicia, but today is southern Lebanon or northern Israel. There was not, and I thought there might be a site there that would line up, the third point on this, and really there was nothing. Until about 6 months ago, I learned about a new site that had been discovered called Israeli Stonehenge. It's in the Golan Heights. It's a series of stone circles with almost like a series of wheels around a center point, but connecting these wheels at certain points are spokes, and that these spokes line up to the solstices and the equinoxes, just as Stonehenge in England and Stonehenge in America did. This site is in the Golan Heights, the ancient homeland of the Phoenicians. And if you look at the dates, the Stonehenge site in the Golan Heights was built about 5,000 years ago, the one in England about 4,000 years ago, and the one in America about 3,500 years ago.
So it's kind of like they were following the sun.
They were ancient sun worshippers. They were worshippers of Baal, and so my
trying to
thought
catch
is
the sun.
they were again, the summer solstice sunrise being the most important day of the year. If you're a sun worshiper, it's the longest day. And so if you reverse engineered these sites and you started with your homeland, and then you went to England and wanted to build a ceremonial site, and again, one of the things about Stonehenge, one of the mysteries is, why is it built where it is? The people who worship there didn't seem to live nearby. But if you're trying to make a site that lines up the summer solstice sunrise to your homeland, that's where you ended up. And then you go another step further. We need another site that lines up to those two. That's how we ended up in southern New Hampshire. Again, not near where the copper was. The copper was in the Great Lakes, but that's the site that's on the line. These sites are 0.6 degrees off of exactly on target. So we go 6,000 miles, and we're less than 1 degree off. Pretty darn impressive. Now,
even by today's standards.
Even by today's, people say, well, how did they do that? And I say, I have no idea, but they did it. It's there. And we know these people were really smart. We know that the ancient Phoenicians were expert navigators, map makers. They knew everything about the stars, astronomy. That they were much smarter than we were, much more advanced than we were. I don't want to say smarter, much more advanced than we are when it came to matters like astronomy, because that was their livelihood. Without that, they couldn't sail and they couldn't make a living. They were really the world's first merchant marine. They were the only ones who could navigate the seas back then, and they did it through the stars. So they understood this stuff. So that site in New Hampshire, and I know I'm sort of going on and on about this, but that site in New Hampshire, I think, lines up to both the site in England, Stonehenge, and also the Israeli Stonehenge site in the Golan Heights, and it all ties back to the Phoenicians, and it's really compelling evidence, I think, that the Phoenicians worked their way across the Atlantic and are responsible for all these sites.
Now, all these stone chambers you found, do they line up with the solstice too?
They do. Almost every stone chamber that we found that we don't think is colonial either has a summer solstice or a winter solstice sunrise or sunset, or they almost all have some kind of unique astronomical alignment. Now, look, I understand that everything the opening of a chamber is going to line up to something at some point. I get that. But these are really specific, unique alignments that only occur on, I would say, one day a year. It's usually 3 days a year because you have, if it's March 21st, you probably could see it on March 20th and March 22nd also. But these chambers were all oriented in such a way that they mark some kind of solar event.
Dave, what you said about Dennis's property and Stonehenge, could be a coincidence, but when you put in a third property that would be a starting point that's even earlier, that would show, give people time to migrate, get established in a location. It makes sense. Three sites straight line. That's not a coincidence.
Well, now there's three. Is there a fourth one?
Well, the fourth one's
west?
the sun. The fourth one's the sun itself. I mean, so it's not just 3 points. It's 3 points plus the sun, the summer solstice sunrise. So there's actually 4 points on this line. Not to mention the. Well, I'm sorry. That is 1 point. So there's 4 points. You asked the question, Thomas. Are there other sites? Are there other points?
Right, further west.
Yeah, somebody emailed me recently. Was there maybe a site related to the Pirámide del Sol in Mexico? And I looked at it. It was a little bit off to me, and so I'm not quite sure about it. But it's very possible that there are other sites. It's also possible that there were sites that have since been lost to history.
Right, so ones we don't know about.
We don't know about, right. So I don't know the answer to that. But I just think it's so far beyond what I would consider to be acceptable coincidence that these sites all line up. And let's not forget, there's other evidence that the Phoenicians built America's Stonehenge. It's not just this. I mean, there's the carving of in Ogum Tubal of the Canaanites that Barry Fell first documented. There's the carbon dating showing the construction time coinciding with the period of the Phoenicians, say 3,500 years ago. There's other evidence of Phoenicians having made transatlantic voyages. There's a lot of other evidence that sort of holds this story together, not just the sunrise alignment.
Well, you also have the Egyptian, also other Middle Eastern areas or cultures bringing some beads to southern England, the Stonehenge area. That's been proven. That's in Dr. Gordon Child has written about that.
I wasn't aware of that, but it doesn't surprise me because if you remember in the first hour we talked about how many people believe that Scotland was settled by Egyptians, Scota, the Princess Scota, and that's what Scotland was named after. And so that doesn't surprise me at all.
It's I don't have the book in front. It's his prehistory of the British Isles. I think that's the title of it. I'll have to confirm that tomorrow, unless.
Oh, and I'm sorry to interrupt, Mark, but just to close that thought, when I say that many people believe the Scots were settled by ancient Egyptians or whoever, it's right in there. They have a Declaration of Independence called the Declaration of Arbroath, and I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly. That was written in the early 1300s, and they recite the history of Scotland, and they talk about how it was settled by these people from what they call Scythia, which was back then was Persia. Scota married a Persian prince, and that's where she got her name. But anyway, it's the same story. Their Declaration of Independence acknowledges their origin, way back in the Middle East.
That's
Well, a lot of people don't realize that the Phoenicians controlled all of the southern Mediterranean at one point.
Right. They had bases all of northern Africa, all of much of the land, all through Spain and Portugal and southern France, but mostly on the southern and eastern sides of the Mediterranean. And we also are pretty sure that they circumnavigated Africa. So the idea that they would have been out in the Atlantic, coming around the tip of Africa and just through sheer dumb luck, at some point you're going to get blown off course and end up hitting Brazil. I mean, it's not that far. So the idea that never happened is crazy. And there's plenty of evidence in South America, showing. We're not going to get into that tonight. Obviously, other people know more about that than I do. But Thor Heyerdahl proved this in his Kon-Tiki voyage. He proved that this could have happened in these reed boats. He did it himself. And what we didn't talk about in the first hour, when we were talking about Brendan the Navigator and his voyage from Ireland across the North Atlantic and ending up in northern Canada or in New England, was that an Irish explorer and adventurer by the name of Tim Severin in the 1970s, he built a boat out of animal skins and animal hides, just as Brendan the Navigator was supposed to have done, and he sailed that boat across the North Atlantic to Newfoundland. So not only could Brendan the Navigator have done it, we know he could have done it because Tim Severin proved it to us using 1,500-year-old technology to sail across the North Atlantic. And if you look at Brendan's voyage, the things he talked about seeing,
the crystal palaces and
right, mountain spouting fire and a smoking hill and a like you said, a floating crystal palace and a sea monster with horned mouths and little furry men, and these were all things you would see across the North Atlantic in Iceland and in Greenland. The sea monster with the horned mouth of the walrus, the little furry men of the Eskimos, of course. The mountain spouting fire is the volcanoes on Iceland. The floating crystal ice palace. You see some of these glaciers and icebergs that float, and they're fascinating designs. And so all the stuff is stuff he could have seen, and then in the end he talks about they arrived at the land of plenty. Well, that's exactly how many Europeans described North America in the 1600s, this land of plenty. So the legend of Brendan the Navigator, the legend always is based on at least a germ of truth. And I think in this case, the legend actually is the truth, that Brendan the Navigator and his men did come across the North Atlantic, and we have the stone chambers in New England that I think prove it.
Okay. Dave, we have a question from Kevin Kilgrave in the chat room, and he was wondering if you knew anything about the Dighton Rock.
Sure. So Dighton Rock is, and it's it's probably the oldest known artifact in New England, in the sense that it was first studied by some of the Puritans back in the 1670s and 1680s. These are the guys who first came here, and they were interested in the Dighton Rock because they thought it might be evidence of one of the lost tribes of Israel. But this rock is in something called the Taunton River. It's south of Boston, maybe 30 or 40 miles, getting close down to almost near where Providence, Rhode Island is. And it's a giant boulder. It is covered with various carvings, different scripts, different images. No one's quite sure what it is, and it's been carved by so many different groups of people that it's almost impossible to determine what's new, what's old, what's modern, what's authentic. It's really a hard thing to see, but we do have pictures of it or drawings of it going back to the late 1600s. The one thing we're fairly certain of is that it's pre-colonial, because the Puritans wouldn't have bothered being fascinated by it if it was done by one of their people. So they thought of it as a historical oddity even when they first settled in the area. I know that Scott Walter on one of the shows, he's tried to look at it with some really modern imaging technologies, and even he can't really make heads or tails of it. One possibility, and I think it's a strong possibility, is that it was carved by very early Portuguese explorers in the very 1505, 1510, in that range, just after Columbus, that there was evidence that some Phoenicians were over here. But it also could go back way earlier. It really could. It's one of those things I don't think we'll ever know for certain. The good thing about the Dighton Rock is it's been preserved. It's in a nice covered little museum-type space. And so someday when technology, smarter people than me can figure out this technology, that someday we'll be able to date these carvings, at least the stone is preserved, and we might someday actually have an answer to at least how old the carvings are, and that might tell us who actually carved it.
Okay, and has there been any talk about doing more episodes for the Lost History of the Giants show?
Not that I've heard of. I think that the Giants are something that I dove deep into that rabbit hole a couple of years ago when I wrote my fourth novel in the series called The Oath of Nimrod. And people ask me about that. They say, "Do you really believe in giants?" And I said, "Well, you know what? It depends on how you define giants. If you're talking about a race of men, of human beings that were in the range of 8 to 9 feet tall, yes, I definitely believe in that. I definitely believe that there's just too many written accounts in the newspapers all over America in the 1800s and early 1900s, going back to the Bible. There's just too much evidence of these 8 to 9 foot large human skeletons being found. To me, yes, I definitely believe that. Now, if you're talking about a giant being 13, 14, 15 feet tall, well, no. At a certain point, physiologically, the human body just can't bear that much weight. I think, personally, that the same giants that are spoken about in the Old Testament, Og and Goliath, those giants all lived in southern Lebanon, the mountains of southern Lebanon. That's the same area that is the homeland of the Phoenicians. And I think it's entirely possible that when the Phoenicians came over to mine their copper, 3,500 years ago, that it would make sense to me that when they came, they brought their biggest, strongest guys, the giants, and that some of those giants may have stayed in North America and interbred with the Native American tribes, and that's why we see these skeletons of these 7.5, 8.5, 9 foot tall giants in these Native American burial mounds. I think that may explain where they came from, and that is consistent with Native American culture and Native American oral history describing how these giants came from across what they call the Sunrise Sea. They call the Atlantic the Sunrise Sea. So again, these pieces of evidence and the oral history, the story holds together. And as a person, my training is as a lawyer, so I'm used to analyzing evidence, and when I write these novels, hopefully the plot holds together. So for me, it's important that the story holds together, that the evidence fits the conclusion. And in the case of the giants, that explanation holds water for me. The story holds together.
Well, my great-grandfather was over 7 foot tall. I mean, there were people that tall,
Right. No, we're not talking just over 7. We're talking over 8, 8.5,
yeah.
9.
Well,
but
I'll tell you what, 7's pretty doggone tall when you're standing next to somebody.
Tall. No doubt about it. No doubt about it. And one of the other things we see often in these giants is a lot of these skeletons, they have a double row of teeth, which is sort of almost like a unique characteristic of this. I'm not going to call them a species. That's not fair, but this race of humans, that they had these double rows of teeth. Many of them did, Yeah, so, look,
there's plenty of American Indian legends of giants that were here.
yeah.
There was white ones there in the Ohio Valley that they talk about. There was the ones out in the Loveless Cave.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that at our peril, we ignore Native American oral history and Native American legend. Their history is just as important to them as ours is to us. We choose to write ours down, and oftentimes our history gets lost because the paper or the tablets we write on gets destroyed. Their history is memorized and passed down generation after generation and can never be lost until or unless there's some kind of genocide. So, their system is probably a lot better than ours. They memorize their stories and their history, and they pass it down. It's just as important to them as ours is to us, but we just think that because it's not written, it has to be, somehow less reliable. And I just think that we ignore that at our peril. I've become friendly recently with a really great guy. He's a Native American tribal chief of the Wampanoag, and I said to him at one point, I won't use his name on the air because that's not fair, but I said to him, so what does your oral history tell you about the Newport Tower? Who built the Newport Tower? And he said, well, our oral history is that it was built by Prince Henry Sinclair and the remnants of the Knights Templar.
Wow.
That's exactly what I've always thought. And I said to him, are you willing to go on record with this? And we were with some other people. He said, yeah. He said, that's what our oral history tells us. And he said it makes sense because whoever did this, they didn't fight their way to the tower and build it under war conditions. They had to have safe passage and some kind of treaty. And our oral history says the only people who did that were Prince Henry Sinclair and the Templars. And so when we get this kind of information from the Native Americans, they don't like to share their history with us because they don't trust us, and I don't blame them. But once in a while they do share stuff. It's not just stupid of us and not just rude of us to ignore it. It's silly of us to ignore it. Why would we ignore really important, compelling, reliable evidence about our own history? But again, if you ask the archaeologists, well, if it didn't come out of the ground, it doesn't matter. It doesn't count, and it's just silly.
Well, Dave, what you were saying about the couple examples that you provided about spokespersons said our people didn't build these mounds or just say Dennis's property. Squire and Davis have a similar reference. There are other documented cases where colonists had these kind of discussions, and with elders, and if you look at the possibility that these giants were the Phoenicians and they came over here and were buried in mounds, there's your answer.
Right, that story all holds itself together. Circling back for a second, because you just reminded me of something, Mark. I brought this Native American tribal chief friend of mine to the America Stonehenge site, and we spent a day there. And at the end of the day, I said, so, he had never been there before. I said, so what do you think? And he said, well, he shook his head. He said, this place is amazing, but we didn't do this. I mean, it's not part of their. It's not what they did. They did the construction technique, just the layout of it, the whole thing. It just wasn't something not that they couldn't have. I mean, they could. The Native Americans are very sophisticated. They just didn't. I mean, he just says it's not ours. We didn't do this.
It would have been part of their oral history had they done something that spectacular.
Exactly. They didn't do it. And some people. I was actually accused once of being racist for saying the Native Americans didn't do it. So it's not racist. They didn't do it. I mean, I said they couldn't. They told me they didn't do it. What do you want me to, just stop already? Stop with the racism.
That's like the Mayans. They said they didn't create them pyramids yet. We give them credit for doing it.
Yeah, I mean, at some point you got to take people at their word. So, yeah, again, this and it's sort of on my soapbox about against the archaeologists today. I just remember I did an interview once of an archaeology professor at the University of Tennessee, and we were looking at something called the Back Creek Stone. And I said, Professor, what if the bones that were found with the Back Creek Stone are found? By the way, the Smithsonian Institute lost them. But what if we find them and we do DNA on those bones, and it turns out that they really are, first century A.D. Middle Eastern bones? I said, will that change your opinion that this artifact might actually tie back to, to the ancient the Israelites, in the first century? Because he was under the position, he continued to take the position that the Back Creek Stone is a fake. I said, so if the DNA tests come back 2,000-year-old Middle Eastern man, will that change your opinion? And he said, no, it really wouldn't. He said, nothing I think would change my opinion since I know the artifact's a fake. I would have to say whatever evidence comes up to the contrary must be flawed evidence somehow. I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, what a strange world this man lives in, where he knows all the answers and no amount of evidence can change his mind. Like, it's, as a lawyer, it's such a backwards way. So I picture myself arguing to the judge, Your Honor, since we know my client is innocent, I therefore think we can stipulate that the fingerprints on the gun are irrelevant.
Yeah,
it's like,
it wouldn't stand up in court.
What kind of world is that? But this professor, this is on camera, and I even gave him a second chance sort of to back off that, and he said, no, I know this artifact is fake, so therefore that evidence must somehow be tainted. Like, oh my gosh, wow. So it must be nice to be smarter than everybody else, I guess.
Dave, speaking of giant Phoenicians coming to America, you're also interested in the red ochre culture making a transatlantic crossing at some point as well. What's your interest with the red ochre people? How many different cultures were in America? If all this is true, it really seems like the way America is now, just all kinds of different people living here.
Right. So red ochre people, some listeners might know these as the red paint people. This is a fascinating. I'm just getting into this now because this is my research for my newest novel. I'm focused sort of on the possibility of the lost continent of Atlantis, and I'm sort of looking for evidence of ancient advanced civilizations. So the red ochre people or red paint people are a group of people that lived along the coast of Canada and New England. We think going back as far as 10,000 years ago. And the reason they're called the red paint people is because their burials contain, there's very few bones that survive, but the bones that do survive are all painted red, the thought being that these people believe they were going to be reincarnated and they want to have blood for their next life. What's really interesting is the items that are found in these burial sites, whether they are arrowheads or harpoon barbs, other tools that are used, adzes, woodworking tools, whatever they are, they're incredibly sophisticated. They are far more sophisticated than the Algonquin tools and weapons that came after them. So at some point, the red paint people sort of faded out of history, and the Algonquin peoples ended up occupying this New England and southern Canada. In southeastern Canada, and their tools, again, are not nearly as sophisticated as the earlier tools, the red paint people tools. And that's not the way things usually work. Usually things
it's kind of ass backwards, isn't it?
Right. Usually things evolve. But we see this sort of same kind of thing we see at Göbekli Tepe, the site in Turkey, where that dates back about 12,000 years, and the earliest carvings and construction at that site is the most sophisticated and the most advanced, and then progressively things get less and less skilled and intricate, and again, that devolves also. So I started thinking that there's a lot, there seems to be, and other sites as well, showing at about 12,000 years ago, there was a high level of sophistication, and then things sort of devolved. If there was indeed a lost colony of Atlantis that got washed away at the end of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago, and there were a few people who survived, those few people may have been able to teach certain skills to other peoples around the world, but that wouldn't have taken hold enough to really survive. It would have been sort of the last vestiges and last dying gasps of a dying people, and that may be what we're seeing at Göbekli Tepe and with the red paint people with some of their really sophisticated tools. And by the way, the red paint people, 10,000 years ago, in most people's mind, including mine, I'm picturing, cavemen, men hitting women over the head with clubs and dragging them back to their cave, really grunting and barely able to make fire. I'm really picturing, cavemen. But these guys, these red paint people, they were out deep sea fishing, hunting swordfish, way out in the Atlantic, cooperatively, groups of them, in really nothing more than glorified canoes. This is sophisticated stuff for supposedly cavemen.
Quite a bit of nerve.
I'm sorry, what was that, Thomas?
They had quite a bit of nerve.
Quite a bit of nerve, and also quite a bit of skill and knowledge. And again, that disappeared. The Algonquin people after them, they took their canoes onto lakes and rivers, but they never went onto the ocean. So there's this evidence of these cultures at the end of the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago, about the same time that supposedly, about the same time that Plato claimed that Atlantis was lost. He gives a date, which is almost exactly the right date, 12,800 years ago, I believe it was, something like that. We see some vestiges of these, what might have been an ancient advanced culture. It's fascinating, and even if that's not the case, it's still fascinating that this red paint people were out there in the middle of the Atlantic hunting whales and swordfish. And by the way, the red paint burials are found not only in New England and Canada, but also in places like the Orkney Islands of Scotland and on the coast of France. So this whole idea, again, that peoples didn't cross the Atlantic until Columbus came. Well, no, even going back 10,000 years ago, these red paint people, this red paint people culture, probably because they're out fishing in the middle of the Atlantic, they went east and they went west. And they knew that the Atlantic could be crossed, and the Atlantic was not a barrier but a highway. And the idea that man, whether ancient man or more modern man, would not have tried to cross the ocean, just out of curiosity, if no other reason, just seems silly to me. I mean, go back to Star Trek and James T. Kirk, to seek out new lives and new civilizations, right? To boldly go where no man's gone before. That's the nature of man. To think that they would have spent thousands of years looking out over the Atlantic and never once venturing across is just silly to me.
We've always been a race of explorers,
Of course. It's not. It's against the human condition. This whole idea that no one ever dared to cross the Atlantic. It's just silly. I just can't even believe that people make the argument with a straight face, not to mention the fact that somehow we teach our kids this. I'm done. I'll get off my.
I got a question for you.
Off, yes, go ahead.
Earlier, you mentioned at American Stonehenge that there was a stone there with a cap on it, like a T. Now, back 12,000 years ago, Göbekli Tepe, all their temples, they had a center post with a cap on it, like a T. Do you think there's any connection?
I'm not aware. I'm not aware of the site of American Stonehenge with a T. Mark, are you aware of that?
I thought that's what you were saying that the sun lined up with.
It was the description of where the.
A tee. I said it. I said a golf tee. I meant a tee like a golf tee.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Like a vertical standing stone, like a pillar. Or obelisk type thing, and you thought I meant a T like the letter T.
Yeah, right.
I apologize for that.
And then you were talking about that the culture 12,000 years ago. That's about the time Göbekli Tepe was covered over.
Yes, and you're right. And there are the letter T's at the site in Turkey. That would have been a fascinating, I won't say coincidence, a fascinating connection between those two sites. But yeah, no, I misspoke there. I apologize.
Well, the Stonehenge is basically a continuation of T's.
Yeah, right. In a circle. See, this was what I was trying to connect to.
Right. Yeah.
The section there. It just kind of hit me kind of funny because when we talked to Dennis, he never mentioned that. Now he did tell me about the stone standing up and that it had been broken, and that they actually made a styrofoam model of it to put it back together to find out what it aligned with.
We hope, by the way, if any listeners are living in the New England area, on March 20th, which is a Sunday, a bunch of us are going to be at the America Stonehenge site for the vernal equinox sunset. So if anybody's around, and that's a fascinating. It's always great to go to America Stonehenge to actually view these phenomena, because it's one thing to look at pictures; it's another thing to actually watch the sun, descend across the horizon and sit right on top of that standing stone in the distance, and you can really feel the magic of the place. And so again, a bunch of us are going to be there on the 20th for sunset if other people want to join us.
Well, that's going to be nice.
Mark, at some point we've got to get you out here to the East Coast to come see some of these sites.
Mark's been to American Stonehenge. I haven't.
Oh, all right. You comment then too, and
I'm stuck down in Georgia in the
Newport
swamps.
Tower and Westford Night. I mean, the New England is so full. The Spirit Pond rune stones. There's a getting back to the Druids that we talked about earlier in relation to the Brenda the Navigator voyage and my Isaac Question novel. There's a site in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is along the Merrimack River, not far from the America Stonehenge site. There's a stone circles very similar to Stonehenge. It's called Druid Hill, and those stones were excavated, and based on weathering, those stones they're vertically standing in the ground again. They were placed there, but they've been standing for at least 1,000 years, perhaps longer, and they could have been part of the Brendan the Navigator visit as well. So there's not just these stone chambers. There's other sites and other pieces of evidence that tie that time period and that area of the world, the Celts and the Druids and the Irish, to North America and to New England, more particularly, in around the 6th century.
Yeah, I'd love to get up there. I'm stuck in Georgia in the swamp, so we got a bunch of gators, but possums.
Take a drive. Just point north and drive.
Yeah, just get on 95 and just keep going.
Right.
I don't drive.
No.
I haven't driven in 30 years.
But it's too long a walk, Thomas. So sorry about that. Maybe get on the train or something.
Now, one day I'll get up there. I'd love to go see Dennis's place. I've done quite a bit of research on it. We've talked to Dennis 3 or 4 times, haven't we, Mark?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, the great thing is if you're at the American Stonehenge site, Dennis's site, within a 2-hour drive, you can see the Newport Tower, the Upton Stone Chamber, the Westford Night Carving, the Narragansett Rune Stone. I mean, within a 2-hour drive, you can see 7 or 8 other great sites too. So it's really pretty compact.
Yeah, I kind of have a feeling there's another trip in the works.
Well, excellent. Let me know. I'd be happy to show you around.
Cool. Okay, thanks. And so, since we're talking about Atlantis, what's some of the other evidence besides Plato's few comments? We've had Frank Joseph on talking about some of the elephants that were found at the bottom of shallow sea and between Spain and
you might be talking about the Sea of Saragossa, maybe is what you're talking about.
Yeah, it was kind of like off Spain, kind of like going north towards England,
It's a little different area that I'm thinking. There's a fascinating story. So you talked about elephants. I'm going to talk about eels. That there are so most eels are freshwater, and there are freshwater eels in Europe, and there are freshwater eels in North America.
Right.
Every 2 years, I believe, the eels in both Europe and North America swim down the rivers and into the ocean, into the Atlantic, and they swim halfway across the Atlantic, and they meet at an area called the Sea of Sargasso, and I might be pronouncing that incorrectly. It's basically near the Bermuda Triangle, but it's a shallow area of the Atlantic where there's a lot of reeds and seaweeds, and that's where they spawn. And then they return to their respective continents and live in freshwater. But it's weird that both the eels in Europe and the ones in North America do the same thing, almost as if they both originated at a landmass where they now return and left there to go find fresh water, and then they return instinctively back to what used to be a continent but now is underwater, a shallow area of the Atlantic.
I've been to the Sargasso Seas, and it's a weird place. It's
part of the Bermuda Triangle. It's a little bit.
There's almost no wind whatsoever about 10 or 12 months out of the year.
Yeah, and so these eels return there. There's also some butterflies off the northern coast of South America that once a year, I forget if it's spring or fall, I don't know when it is, they fly out as far as they can north into the Sargasso Sea and die, as if they're looking for land. So that's sort of interesting. This imprinted in their memories of these species is the idea that at one point there was a landmass out there. Some migratory birds do the same thing. They circle around and around and around looking for land out there as if there once was.
And so, there's connections like the Bimini Road and
Bimini Road thing.
So it's real possible that there could have been some sort of land mass out there.
Yeah, there's a lot of sort of there's some DNA work that's been done. I'm not going to get too much into that tonight because it's sort of complicated stuff. But there's also interesting linguistic. The word Atlantis. Obviously, it's similar to the word atlas, but also the word addle, which is a weapon, addle, which is a weapon from Central America. But that's a fairly rare root for a word, the ATL combination. So some people point to that as being evidence that some of the Atlanteans ended up in Central America, Mexico and Central America. The thing that I found the most compelling was when Plato, who was writing about Atlantis in 400 BC, specifically said that it was destroyed 10,400 years before he was writing, which gives you 12,800 before present, and that's right exactly pretty much the time of the end of the last ice age. I mean, the dates really work well for that, and for Plato to have been that accurate, he didn't obviously know when the last ice age ended. For him to get the dates that close is really pretty interesting. I would recommend anybody who's interested in this that Graham Hancock's new book, Magicians of the Gods. It's sort of a follow-up to Fingerprints of the Gods. He gets into a lot of this stuff and focusing in on this idea that at around that time period, around the end of the last ice age, say, let's again, 12,800 before present, I might be a little off on those dates, but he finds evidence all around the globe of these, the remnants of some kind of advanced civilization still existing, as if there were some people who survived the calamity at Atlantis. Perhaps people were out on trade missions or out at sea and they were able to survive, and that those people tried to sort of impart their wisdom, their knowledge to the rest of the peoples of the earth, and it didn't really hold, but that there was evidence that they tried, and there was, again, the last gasp of a dying culture in different areas around the world. The Sphinx, for example, some fascinating studies by a Boston University professor who claims that there's evidence that the water damage along the base of the Sphinx proves that it was around 12,000 years ago. You guys probably have heard of that as well. But
we had Dr. Schock on one time.
Yeah, Dr. Schock, thank you. Robert Schock, yeah, thank you. So that's a fascinating thing to me, and that's hard science. Again, the archaeologists don't like that kind of stuff, but other scientists do matter. Scientists are scientists for a reason. It's not just opinion. It's, in that particular case, there's hard science backing up his claim. And you can't just pick and choose evidence and say, well, we're not going to look at that evidence because it doesn't support our theory. Instead, you need to come up with a theory that allows for all the evidence, all the science to be accounted for. And if you can't do that, that means you have the wrong theory. Your theory is flawed. That's the way this works. That's the way the scientific method works. And I'm just getting frustrated by these archaeologists who literally they stick their head in the sand, and then they complain that they can't see anything. Well, take your head out of the sand.
We're being lately. My hat's off to these amateur archaeologists, because they're bringing to light a lot of this stuff that has been just plain pushed to the side and not told us about.
Right. I belong to a group up, and this is my first start in this. A group up here in New England called the New England Antiquities Research Association, and that's what this group does. They spend their time going out into the woods, out into the field, investigating these potential sites. As a matter of fact, Mark, you may know, Dennis Stone's father founded Mira.
Right, and we we had a couple Steve DiMarzo on.
Right, he was on recently, right?
Yeah, a month or so ago.
Right. Steve does great work. He's the Rhode Island coordinator of NERA. And by the way, just as a little footnote, I'm not sure if you knew this, Bob Stone, Dennis Stone's father, founded NERA. His co-founder, or one of the early other co-founders of NERA, was a gentleman by the name of Malcolm Pearson. And Malcolm Pearson first got interested in this because he grew up next to the Upton Chamber, the chamber that I first started talking about that sparked this whole novel of mine. His backyard contained the Upton Chamber. And so little Malcolm Pearson, 8-year-old, crawling around his backyard, found this chamber, and that's what sparked all of this. It's a fascinating thing that just one little boy, that's what started, NERA and a lot of this research, and he happened to find a chamber, a stone chamber, buried under the brush in his backyard, a little 8-year-old boy.
And they say you got to go to Europe to see great archaeology sites, and I don't believe it.
There's plenty to see here. I mean, it really is. And when you mentioned the amateurs, I think you're right. And again, at some point, some professional archaeologist who wants to make a name for his or herself is going to take the plunge and say, you know what, I'm going to give this a shot, and I don't care if I get ostracized because I can really make a name for myself. Someone's going to do that, and they're going to be really thankful they did. But it's going to take someone with some courage and some confidence, and
it takes a good 30 years to change history, written history.
Usually it takes a generation. I agree with you on that, Thomas. Yes.
We've only got about 2 minutes left, and I want to make sure people know how to get a hold of you.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate that. So, I haven't probably mentioned, my name's David Brody. I am a writer of historical fiction. I've got 5 novels. All of them dealing with the topic of exploration of America before Columbus. They are called the Templars in America series. The easiest place to get them is on Amazon. My last name is spelled Brody. The books are all under $15. I want to make them cheap. I want them accessible. They're available on Kindle and Nook for under $5. You can go to my website, davidbrodybooks.com. There's a link on my website to my blog where I try to write about all these different sites, and when I go out and look at summer solstice alignments or see a new carving or a new artifact, I try to write about it. This is my passion. My wife calls it my midlife crisis. The reason I do it in the fictional format is I think it's a really fun way to learn about these things. I like nothing better than diving into a good novel and having that novel take me to a place I've never been before, and really learn some things I've never learned about before, at the same time being on a bit of a thrill ride, a little roller coaster.
I hate to cut you off, but that's it. It's getting to the point where they're not going to be able to hear you. Reminding everybody we are totally listener supported, so if you got a buck or two, we'd sure appreciate it. Thank you for joining us tonight. Have a good night. Say good night, Mark.
Hey, see everyone next week. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, guys. Really appreciate it. Had a great time.